that oppression or that colonization at school, through your education, how people teach you. I'm sure you've experienced many different approaches of being taught, not through your native language or a natural language. So in that way, it's unequal and unhealthy. Let me think of another example here. If you had a country like France, which would be the deaf community, and the hearing community would be England, do they have the same culture? Same foods? Same art? Same music? No, both countries have different sets of music and art and so forth. Now, if a person goes to see France, or if another person goes to see England, you're able to understand and share the cultural values based on cultural respect, equal respect, and that's healthy. But that doesn't happen these days. This is what we have right now, unequal and unhealthy. So this is something I'd like for you to become aware of, and also to think of how we can change this aspect for it to be equal. I consider this a guide to what I'm about to show you. Yes.
So then you'd be missing music, for example. Like, oh, right now I can hear music and it's really distracting.
Instructor. Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. Someone is playing music. Could you please turn it off? Whoever it is, can you turn down your music or turn it off? Great. Thank you so much for letting us know. Question.
Yeah, what does the word solitaire mean, or solitary?
It means to be alone. You're the only deaf person, say, in a mainstream school or in a all-hearing environment. So here's another sign for it. This is a sign for mainstream, where there are many deaf students and hearing students together. But this is when someone is just one deaf student compared to within a sea of hearing students. I have to look at the research again, but I would say 70 to 86% of deaf children in America today are the only deaf child in their school.
So let's say there were 3 deaf students with cochlear implants at a school. Would you sign mainstream with the 2 5 hands?
Actually, it's good to have peers, but maybe I would sign it like this to indicate that there are 2 or 3 deaf students within a predominantly hearing environment. Research shows quite evidently that what we learn, 80% of what we learn is outside of the classroom. From your peers, your friends, your interactions with your friends and peers. So only 20% of what you learn is inside the classroom. So that means you really do need to have a big group of people who understand you, who you can interact with and communicate with. So all of this up here on the screen are from that philosophy of colonization and oppression. The thought of that, deaf culture is not important, that you can learn it later, that you need to assimilate to the hearing world. And let me show you a quote. Okay, so this quote still exists and still influences. Oh, you have a question?
Yeah, I know who that guy is. Alexander Graham Bell. He had a deaf wife and loved her.
She, if I remember correctly, he also had a deaf mother. So he had a deaf mother and a deaf wife. Okay, so let me talk a little bit more about that. But here's another quote. So if we go back to the first quote I shared, this connects to identity, your birthright, a healthy identity to be a deaf individual. But the system took that away from you, from all of us, advising you to learn how to speak into a spoken language. But within the deaf community, do deaf people have a problem with speaking into a spoken language? No. I mean, I know that there are many deaf people who could speak into a spoken language or even use the phone, and that's fine, and that's not a problem. The problem is that people have taken away our culture, our language, our identity, our values, and that's what makes us unique. And this has happened to many hard of hearing, thousands of hard of hearing and deaf people, and that's just completely not right, and it needs to stop. We want all deaf and hard of hearing people to grow up having a deaf adult, a role model, to have a full, accessible visual language. And if they want to learn how to speak and lip read, that's completely fine. We want you to have a healthy relationship with your family, your parents, your aunts and uncles. In Sweden, the government pays for 600 hours of sign language or Swedish Sign Language instruction to the hearing families. 600 hours is paid for of instruction for anyone in the family to learn the sign language. That deaf child is then ready and is able to acquire the visual language. They are ready for schooling and ready to learn because they have a foundational language. Sadly, 15 years ago, a German doctor, or a doctor from Germany, who did cochlear implant surgeries, actually convinced the Swedish government to fund cochlear implants and have less funding toward the sign language instruction. So it was first 600 hours of language instruction, and they convinced them to go down to just 60 hours of of sign language instruction. So again, that's a problem, and the system reflects back to the unequal respect of cultures and languages. I love being deaf. I love deaf people. I love the community. Now to the second quote I showed you. If we look at this quote, and we could talk more about this and debate it, but if you think about this world we live in, it's a man's world, right? I mean, we can talk about that, but no, I see some no's, and I agree with you. It's not a man's world, it's not a dominated man's world, but do men and women get paid equally?
No, not yet.
Exactly, so there's still a disparity in pay. Do men and women have the same or higher level positions as far as percentage-wise? No. Only 17% of women are filling those higher level positions, like being a CEO or the boss of a particular company. How about in the government? Do we have equal representation between males and females in the government? No. If we look at Congress, Congress is trying to pass laws to actually control female bodies. They're trying to pass these particular laws, and it just makes you wonder. Now, if we follow Alexander Graham Bell's thinking and his quote-unquote logic, that it's better to train all women or all girls in school to act and behave like a man, to have them, you know, put their hands in their pants, scratch their bellies, you know, however men do, and that they would be able to succeed in the man's world. So that means that we would erase the woman's femininity and to make them more macho. Is that a good idea? No, that's not a good idea at all. That type of thinking is not good. If you see the Secretary of State, who was the first woman, was Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright. She was the first female Secretary of State, and she was able to talk about nuclear warfare with Russia and other countries. Again, she's a female in a room debating and talking about these important issues in our world. And her being a female has completely changed the tone of the discussion. So females are able to bring their unique view and perspective on these important items. So to erase that uniqueness, an important part of a particular perspective, that would make the world, and has created this world, to be a much less smarter and more poorer type of place. So that kind of colonization from the system does truly happen, and here's some facts related to that. If you look at the first bullet point here, talking about the general American public, there's about 20% of people who have had related traumatic experience, physically, mentally. If we're thinking about mental trauma, I'm not talking about depression or someone who may be bipolar or schizophrenic. I'm talking about someone who has experienced some kind of traumatic event. It could be someone being in a war,
Having a terrible car accident.
have been in a terrible car accident, have witnessed something horribly traumatic, maybe walking on a street and see a car blow up, or actually the car makes a sound that sounds like a firework, and then would make someone think about that traumatic experience that they had maybe by being close to a bomb that has ignited. So that's the kind of trauma I'm talking about. Now, the general population of Americans have experienced 20% of that trauma. Now, if you look within the deaf community, there are 50% of the deaf community who have experienced that kind of trauma. Look at each other. We would just divide this room. Half of this room, the people in this room, have experienced that type of trauma. That affects a person's work relationship, how they communicate, how they develop their self, and how they're able to manage themselves within a team. That's internal pain they experience every day. Men actually...
There was a doctor named Dr. Sanjay Gulati, Gulati, and he has done some research. He's a psychologist. And what they've seen is that there are people who have extreme language deprivation, and people who grow up in language deprivation. For example, when you try to teach them to speak in lip reading,